The dust devil that twisted across the platform at Sweetwater Station that April morning in 1882 seemed to announce her arrival before the train whistle ever did. And when Nora Fitzgerald stepped down onto the weathered planks with nothing but a battered banjo case clutched in both hands, every soul waiting there went silent as Sunday church. Nora's auburn hair had come loose from its pins during the 3-day journey from St. Louis, and her green traveling dress bore the unmistakable stains of coal smoke and hard miles. She stood there on the platform, searching the handful of faces with eyes the color of spring grass, looking for the man whose letters had convinced her to leave everything behind. The banjo case caught the sunlight, its brass fittings winking like promises. A tall man in dusty boots and a worn leather vest separated himself from the others. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that surrounded the town. His blue eyes took in the sight of her, then the banjo, then the conspicuous absence of trunks or bags or any of the usual accompaniments of a woman arriving to start a new life. Miss Fitzgerald. His voice was rough as gravel but not unkind. Yes. She lifted her chin, daring him to comment on her circumstances. You must be Mr. Garrett. James Garrett took 3 steps forward and stopped an arm's length away. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the calluses on his hands, the dust that seemed permanently worked into the creases of his clothes. He looked at the banjo case again, and something shifted in his expression. Not disappointment exactly, but calculation, as if he were working through a problem in his head. That is all we need here, he said finally, and the words came out with such certainty that Nora felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite relief, but close enough. She had expected questions. Where were her things? What kind of woman traveled halfway across the country with nothing but a musical instrument? But James Garrett just reached for the banjo case, and when she hesitated, he said, I will carry it. The wagon is this way. Nora followed him through Sweetwater Station's excuse for a town. There was a general store with a false front that made it look grander than it was, a saloon called the Dusty Rose, a livery stable, and a scattering of other buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vast emptiness of the Wyoming Territory. The mountains rose in the distance like purple promises, but here everything was red earth and sage and sky so big it made her feel like an ant. The wagon was exactly what she expected, weathered wood and practical lines. James set the banjo case gently in the back, which surprised her. Most men she had known would have tossed it like any other piece of luggage. He helped her up onto the seat with a hand under her elbow, his touch brief and impersonal, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. They rode in silence for the first mile. The town fell away behind them, and there was nothing but the creak of the wagon, the clip of the horses' hooves, and the whisper of wind through the sage. Nora kept her hands folded in her lap and tried not to think about what she had done, how far she had come, how impossible it would be to go back even if she wanted to. The ranch is another hour, James said finally. It is not much, but it is mine. Bought it 3 years ago with money I saved working cattle drives. Got 200 acres, decent water, good grass. Built the house myself. Nora nodded. His letters had told her all this, though the words on paper had seemed more poetic somehow. He had written about the mountains and the stars, and the feeling of building something that would last. She had written back about music and her family and the little town in Missouri where she had grown up. Neither of them had been entirely honest, she suspected, but that was the nature of letters between strangers. I should explain, she started, then stopped. How did you explain to a man you had just met that you had sold everything you owned to pay for your father's funeral? That the boarding house where you had been staying had burned down a week before you were supposed to leave? That you had spent your last dollars on the train ticket and counted yourself lucky to have the banjo because it had been at the music hall where you gave lessons? No need, James said. He kept his eyes on the road. I figure everyone has their reasons. You are here. That is what matters. She looked at him properly then, this man who had agreed to marry her sight unseen based on letters and a photograph that was 3 years old. He was younger than she had expected, probably not more than 28 or 29 to her 24. His profile was strong, his hands steady on the reins. There was something solid about him, something that made her think of oak trees and stone foundations. Can you really play that thing? He gestured toward the back of the wagon with his chin. Yes, she allowed herself a small smile. Can you really rope a steer from a galloping horse? The corner of his mouth twitched. Yes. Then I suppose we both have useful skills. He did smile then, brief as lightning but real. I suppose we do. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, and Nora felt her breath catch. The house was small, just 4 rooms if she had to guess, but it was well built with a solid roof and a covered porch that ran along the front. There was a barn, a corral with several horses, and beyond that the land rolled away toward the mountains in shades of gold and green. A creek cut through the property, marked by a line of cottonwood trees that were just starting to leaf out. It is beautiful, she said, and meant it. James pulled the wagon up in front of the house and set the brake. Needs a woman's touch inside. I am not much for decoration. He helped her down, and this time his hand lingered a moment longer on her arm. When she looked up at him, she found him studying her face as if trying to memorize it. Then he stepped back and grabbed the banjo case. I will show you around, then we can talk about the arrangements. The inside of the house was exactly as she had imagined, clean but Spartan, with furniture that was clearly handmade and functional rather than beautiful. The main room served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. There were 2 bedrooms, one barely big enough for the narrow bed it contained, and a small room that might have been meant for storage but was currently empty. James set the banjo case on the table. I sleep in the smaller room. I thought you should have the bigger one, seeing as you are a woman and probably have more need of space. We can work out the other arrangements as we go. Nora understood what he was saying without saying. He was giving her time, not pushing. She had been braced for a very different kind of arrival, and the relief was almost dizzying. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded. There is a preacher comes through every 2 weeks. He was here 4 days ago, so it will be another 10 days before we can make it official. I hope that is acceptable. Yes. 10 days to decide if she could really do this. 10 days to get to know this stranger she had agreed to marry. It seemed both too long and not nearly long enough. I will leave you to settle in. There is a pump out back for water. Outhouse is past the barn. I need to check on the stock, but I will be back in an hour or so to fix supper. He paused at the door. I am glad you are here, Miss Fitzgerald. I know this is not what you probably expected, but I will do my best to make it work. Then he was gone, and Nora was alone in the house that might become her home. She stood in the middle of the main room for a long moment, just breathing. Then she went to the table, opened the banjo case, and lifted out the instrument. The wood was smooth under her fingers, familiar and comforting. She carried it to the rocking chair by the fireplace, sat down, and began to play. The music filled the small house, spilling out through the open windows and across the land. She played the songs her mother had taught her, the reels and ballads and hymns that had been the soundtrack of her childhood. She played until her fingers ached and the sun had moved halfway across the sky. She played until she felt like herself again, until the long journey and the uncertainty and the fear had been transformed into something bearable. When she finally stopped, James was standing in the doorway. She had no idea how long he had been there. He did not say anything, just looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he came into the house and moved toward the kitchen area. That was something, he said, his back to her as he pulled out a skillet and a slab of bacon. I have not heard music like that since I left Tennessee. You are from Tennessee? She had not known that. His letters had not mentioned it, long time ago, left when I was 15. He started slicing the bacon with quick, efficient movements. That is a different life. Nora set the banjo carefully aside and stood. "What can I do to help?" He glanced at her over his shoulder. "You know how to make biscuits?" "My mother would disown me if I did not." "Flour is in the tin on the shelf. Lard is in the crock. Go ahead and use what you need." They worked in a companionable silence, moving around each other in the small kitchen space with the awkward politeness of strangers. Nora mixed the biscuits while James fried the bacon and put coffee on to boil. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, noting the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way his hands knew exactly what to do. There was something peaceful about him, she thought, something steady. They ate at the table as the sun began to set, painting the sky outside the windows in shades of orange and gold. The food was simple but good, and Nora realized she had not eaten since yesterday. James ate with the single-minded focus of a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure, but he nodded appreciatively when he tried her biscuits. "These are better than anything I have made in 3 years," he said. The bacon was good too. It is hard to ruin bacon. But he smiled when he said it. After supper, Nora insisted on washing up. James dried, and they established a rhythm that felt like it might, with time, become natural. When the dishes were done, he poured them both more coffee and they took it out to the porch. The night was coming on fast now, stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. "It gets cold at night, even in spring," James said. "There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. I will be fine." Nora wrapped her hands around the warm cup and breathed in the smell of coffee and sage and something else she could not name. Freedom, maybe, or possibility. "Tell me about Missouri," James said. "Your letters made it sound nice." So she told him about the little town where she had grown up, the white church with its copper bell, the river where she used to fish with her brother. She told him about teaching music lessons to the merchant's daughters, about the social club that met every Thursday, about the life that had seemed so certain until it all fell apart. She did not tell him about the debts her father had left behind, or the way the people she had thought were friends had turned away when she needed help. She did not tell him about the nights she had lain awake in the boarding house, terrified of ending up on the streets. Some things were too raw to share with a stranger, even a stranger you planned to marry. In turn, James told her about Tennessee, though he clearly found it harder to talk about. He had left home young, worked on riverboats and cattle drives, drifted west with the restless energy of a young man looking for something he could not name. He had found it here, in this hard land that demanded everything and gave back only what you could wrest from it with your own 2 hands. "I want to build something that lasts," he said, staring out at the darkening land. "Something I can be proud of. I thought that having a wife, building a family, that would be part of it. But I am not a man who is good with words, and I do not know much about courting. I figured letters were my best chance." "They were good letters," Nora said softly. "They made me think you were someone worth taking a chance on." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. Not desire exactly, but interest. "Possibility. I am glad you took the chance," he said. They sat in silence after that, drinking their coffee and watching the stars come out. The night sound surrounded them, crickets and the distant howl of a coyote and the rustle of the wind through the grass. Nora felt the exhaustion of the long journey settling into her bones, but she was not ready to go inside yet. This moment felt important somehow, like they were establishing something that would matter later. Finally, James stood. "You must be tired. I will show you where everything is, and then I will let you get some rest." He led her inside, lit a lamp in the larger bedroom, and showed her the chest with the extra blankets. There was a basin and pitcher for washing, a peg on the wall for hanging clothes, and a small mirror that looked like it had been an afterthought. The bed was covered with a quilt that had seen better days but was clean and well-mended. "If you need anything, I will be in the next room," James said from the doorway. "Sleep well, Miss Fitzgerald." "Nora," she said. "Please call me Nora," he nodded. "Nora, and you should call me James." "Good night, James. Good night." When she was alone, Nora sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel everything she had been holding back. Fear and hope and exhaustion, and a strange kind of excitement that she did not quite trust. She had gambled everything on this, on a man she did not know and a life she could barely imagine. But sitting here in this small room in this house on the edge of nowhere, she did not regret it. Not yet anyway. She changed into her nightgown, the only piece of clothing she owned that was not on her back or being worn through from too much use. She washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher and brushed out her hair. Then she climbed into bed and pulled the quilts up to her chin. The mattress was stuffed with corn husks and crackled when she moved, but it was comfortable enough through the thin wall. She could hear James moving around in the next room. The sounds were oddly comforting, a reminder that she was not alone out here. She closed her eyes and listened to the night, to the vast silence that was so different from the constant noise of the city. And somewhere in that silence, she found sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and the pale light of dawn creeping through the window. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic fluttered in her chest. Then it all came back and she sat up, pushing her hair out of her face. She could hear James moving around in the main room, the clink of the stove and the sound of water being poured. Nora dressed quickly in the same green traveling dress, which was looking worse for wear but was all she had. She would need to do something about clothes soon, but that was a problem for another day. She splashed water on her face, pinned up her hair, and went out to face her first real day in Wyoming. James was at the stove frying eggs. He glanced up when she came in, and something that might have been relief crossed his face. Had he thought she might have run away in the night? "Where would she even go, morning?" he said. "Breakfast will be ready in a minute. Can I help? Coffee is hot if you want to pour." She found 2 cups and poured the strong black coffee, then set them on the table. James brought over the eggs and more biscuits, left over from last night and warmed in the oven. They sat and ate, and if the silence was a little awkward, it was not uncomfortable. "I need to ride out and check the fence line on the south pasture," James said when they were finished. "We'll take most of the day. You are welcome to come along if you want, or you can stay here and get settled. There is food in the pantry and the chickens need feeding around noon. Eggs are in the barn." Nora considered. Part of her wanted to go with him, to see the land and learn what his days looked like. But another part of her needed time alone, time to process everything and figure out what she was going to do about clothes and 100 other practical concerns. "I will stay here," she said. "If that is all right. Of course, make yourself at home. It is your home now or will be soon enough." He stood and carried his dishes to the basin. "I will be back before dark." She watched him go, saw him saddle a sturdy bay horse and ride off toward the south. Then the house was hers, and she stood in the middle of it wondering where to begin. The first thing she did was explore properly. The pantry was better stocked than she had expected, with flour and cornmeal and dried beans, canned goods and preserves that someone had clearly put up last fall. There was a root cellar behind the house with potatoes and onions and carrots keeping cool in the earth. The barn held 4 horses besides the one James was riding, plus half a dozen chickens scratching around in a small coop. There was a milk cow who regarded Nora with patient brown eyes. She found a basket and collected eggs, then went back to the house and spent the morning cleaning. James kept things neat, but there was a layer of dust that spoke of a man living alone, and the windows had not been properly washed in months. She scrubbed and swept and polished, and with each task, she felt more like this place might actually become hers. Around noon, she made herself lunch from bread and cheese she found in the pantry, then took the banjo out to the porch. She played for an hour, letting the music carry across the empty land. It felt different here, her playing. In Missouri, she had always been conscious of neighbors listening, of having to maintain a certain respectability. Here, there was no one to hear except the wind and the horses and maybe James, somewhere out there checking his fences. She experimented with songs she had never dared to play in public, wild reels and body ballads, and the sad, lonesome tunes her mother used to hum while working. The banjo responded like it was glad to be free too, the notes bright and clear in the thin mountain air. When she finally set it aside, the sun was past its peak, and the air had taken on the quality of afternoon. Nora went inside and started thinking about supper. She found a ham in the pantry and put it on to boil with the last of the dried beans. She made more biscuits and used some of the preserves to put together a simple cobbler from canned peaches. It felt good to cook in a kitchen that was, at least potentially, her own. James rode in just as the sun was starting to set, his horse dusty and his face tired. He unsaddled and tended to the animal before coming to the house, and Nora appreciated that about him. A man who took care of his stock before himself was a man who understood what mattered. He stopped at the door when he saw her at the stove, and something in his expression softened. "Smells good. I hope you are hungry. Always am after a day in the saddle." He washed up at the pump outside, and when he came in, his hair was damp and slicked back from his face. They sat down to eat, and this time the silence was easier. James complimented the food, and Nora told him about her day. She did not mention how strange it felt to be here, how sometimes she had looked up expecting to see familiar faces and found only emptiness. Those feelings would pass, she told herself. They had to. "I was thinking," James said as they finished eating, "you are going to need clothes. There is a seamstress in town, Mrs. Chen. She is good and fair with her prices. I can take you in tomorrow if you like." Nora felt her cheeks warm. "I do not have any money, not until I can find work, or—" "You do not need money," James cut her off gently. "I have an account at the general store. We will get what you need." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking, I am offering." He looked at her steadily. "You are going to be my wife, Nora. That means what is mine is yours. I do not have much, but what I have I share." She felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had grown so used to having to fight for everything, to being a burden, that simple generosity felt overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded, looking uncomfortable with her emotion. "We will go in the morning then. Make a list of what you need." That night they sat on the porch again, and James asked her to play. Nora brought out the banjo and played the gentler songs, the ones her mother had loved. James listened in silence, his face turned up to the stars. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My mother played the piano," he said finally. "Back in Tennessee. She died when I was 12. I have not heard music in a house since then. I forgot how much I missed it." Nora's heart ached for him, for the boy who had lost his mother and then left everything else behind. "I will play whenever you like." "I would like that." They went into town the next morning in the wagon. The road was rough but scenic, winding through country that was beginning to green up with spring growth. James pointed out landmarks as they went, the creek where he fished, the stand of pines where deer liked to bed down, the neighbor's ranch 3 miles to the east. "Tom Holloway and his wife Sarah," he said. "Good people. They have been here longer than me. Sarah will probably come by once she hears I brought a bride home." Sweetwater Station looked slightly less depressing in full daylight. There were more people on the street, cowboys and miners and a few families going about their business. James helped Nora down from the wagon and led her to the general store, which also served as the post office and the social hub of the town. The proprietor, a round man with impressive mutton chops, greeted James warmly and looked at Nora with open curiosity. "So this is the bride we have been hearing about. Welcome to Sweetwater, miss. I am George Brennan. Nora Fitzgerald, pleased to meet you." "She needs clothes," James said. "Can you direct us to Mrs. Chen, just next door? Tell her I sent you." George winked at Nora. "And welcome again. It is nice to have another respectable woman in town. Lord knows we need more civilizing influence around here. Mrs. Chen's shop was small but organized with the precision of a military campaign. The seamstress herself was a tiny Chinese woman with silver threads in her black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked Nora up and down in one assessing glance, then nodded. "You need everything, I think." "Come, we get measurements. For the next hour, Nora was measured and shown fabrics and asked about her preferences. Mrs. Chen was efficient and no-nonsense, but there was kindness in the way she handled the worn traveling dress, in the way she suggested styles that would be practical for ranch life but still feminine. "I can have 2 everyday dresses ready in 3 days," Mrs. Chen said. "One more nice dress for church and town in a week. You also need undergarments, yes, and nightgowns?" Nora nodded, acutely aware of James standing by the door trying not to look interested in the conversation. Mrs. Chen bundled together shifts and drawers and stockings, adding them to the growing pile of goods. When they were finished, the total made Nora wince, but James paid without blinking. He also insisted on stopping at the general store for fabric for kitchen curtains and other small items that Nora had not even thought to ask for. "You are spending too much," she protested as George wrapped up thread and needles and a bolt of cheerful yellow calico. "I am making an investment," James said. "Happy wife, happy life, or so I have been told," George laughed. "Smart man, Garrett, you will do fine." On the way out of town, James stopped the wagon at the top of a rise and pointed west. "That is where the ranch starts. 200 acres from here to that far tree line. I have been thinking of expanding, maybe running more cattle, but that would take more hands and I cannot afford to hire anyone yet. What do you run now? About 50 head of beef cattle plus the horses. It is enough to make a living, but not much more. I want to build it up though, make it something substantial." He looked at her. "Does that sound all right to you? Living small while we build something bigger?" "It sounds fine," Nora said honestly. "I am not afraid of hard work." "No, I do not imagine you are." He smiled at her, that quick flash of warmth that transformed his serious face. "Not with the way you play that banjo. That takes dedication." They spent the afternoon working on the ranch together. James showed Nora how to feed the cattle, how to check the water troughs, how to muck out stalls. She learned quickly, and he was a patient teacher. By the time they finished, she was dusty and sweaty and her back ached, but she felt good. Useful. That night, she made stew while James mended a bridle. They were getting used to sharing space, she realized, learning to move around each other to anticipate needs. It was not love, not yet, but it was something. A foundation, maybe. 8 more days until the preacher comes, James said out of nowhere, Nora's hands stilled on the spoon. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No." He looked up from the bridle, his blue eyes serious. "Are you?" She considered the question honestly. Was she having second thoughts? She barely knew this man. But in the 2 days since she had arrived, she had seen enough to believe he was decent and honest and hardworking. He had been kind without being overbearing, generous without making her feel like a charity case. And there was something between them, a spark of possibility that made her think maybe this could work. "No," she said. "No second thoughts." "Good." He went back to his mending, but she could see the tension ease from his shoulders. The next few days fell into a pattern. They worked together during the day, James teaching Nora the rhythms of ranch life and Nora bringing small touches of comfort to the house. She played the banjo in the evenings and James listened. They talked more, sharing bits of their histories in careful increments. They were circling each other, she thought, like cautious animals deciding if it was safe to come closer. On the 3rd day, Sarah Holloway arrived in a wagon driven by a weathered man who must be her husband Tom. Sarah was a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and capable hands. She brought a loaf of bread and a jar of honey as welcome gifts. "I heard James had finally brought his bride home," she said, pulling Nora into a hug before they had even been properly introduced. "I am so glad. This man has been living like a hermit for too long." Tom shook hands with James and offered his congratulations. Then the 4 of them sat on the porch and talked. Sarah wanted to know everything about Nora, and while some of her questions were intrusive, they came from a place of genuine interest rather than nosiness. Tom and James talked about cattle prices and the weather, the eternal concerns of ranchers everywhere. "You come by any time you need anything," Sarah told Nora as they were leaving. "And I mean that. This country can be hard on women, especially women not used to it. You do not have to do it alone." After they left, Nora felt lighter somehow. She had an ally, someone she could turn to if things got overwhelming. It made the vastness of the territory feel a little less lonely. The day before the preacher was due to arrive, James rode into town to pick up Nora's new dresses from Mrs. Chen. When he returned, she tried them on in her bedroom and felt like a new person. The everyday dresses were practical calico in blue and brown, with sturdy fabric that would stand up to work. The better dress was a soft gray wool that made her eyes look greener. They fit perfectly, and Nora felt tears of gratitude sting her eyes. That night, James seemed restless. He paced the porch after supper, and Nora could feel nervous energy radiating off him. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" she asked finally. He stopped pacing and leaned against the porch rail. "Not worried exactly, just thinking about what it means. Marriage is permanent, or it should be. I want to make sure I do right by you." Nora set down the banjo and went to stand beside him. Without really thinking about it, she reached out and took his hand. It was the first time they had touched beyond the necessary courtesies, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. "I think you will do fine," she said softly. "We both will." He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. In the moonlight, his expression was unreadable. Then he lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that it made her heart flutter. "Thank you for taking a chance on me," he said. "Thank you for giving me one." They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, looking out at the silver-touched land. Nora felt something shift between them, some invisible line being crossed. This was real now. Tomorrow it would be official, but tonight, standing here with their hands joined, it became real in her heart. The wedding took place in the Holloway's front parlor, since their house was bigger than James's and could accommodate the handful of people who attended. The preacher was a circuit rider named Elijah Stone, a man with a long beard and a longer history of bringing religion to the frontier. He performed the ceremony with simple dignity, his words about commitment and faith echoing in the small room. Nora wore her gray wool dress and had woven wildflowers into her hair. James wore his best shirt and had actually shaved, which made him look younger and more vulnerable. When it came time to exchange vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I, James Garrett, take you, Nora Fitzgerald, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to provide for you, to protect you, and to honor you all the days of my life." Nora's voice shook slightly, but she got the words out. "I, Nora Fitzgerald, take you, James Garrett, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you, to build a life with you, and to honor you all the days of my life." There were no rings, but when the preacher declared them married, James kissed her gently, chastely, and Nora felt the world tilt and resettle. She was married. This man was her husband. This life was truly hers now. Sarah had prepared a small feast, and they ate and talked and accepted congratulations from the few neighbors who had come. George Brennan from the general store was there, and Mrs. Chen, and a few of the other ranchers from the area. They were a small community, but they were a community, and Nora felt welcomed in a way she had not expected. As they drove home in the wagon, the sun setting behind them, James reached over and took her hand again. They did not speak, but the silence was comfortable now, full of possibility rather than awkwardness. When they reached the house, James helped her down and stood looking at her for a long moment. "I will not rush you," he said quietly. "We can take as much time as you need." Nora felt warmth spread through her chest. He was giving her control, giving her choice. It was a gift, and she recognized it as such. "Thank you," she said. Then, surprising herself, she added, "But I do not think I need as much time as you might think." His eyes widened slightly, and she saw hope flare in them. "No, no." She reached up and cupped his cheek, feeling the slight rasp of stubble that had grown in since the morning. "You are a good man, James Garrett, and I want to be your wife in every sense of the word." He kissed her then, really kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste peck in the Holloway's parlor. It was deep and searching and full of the longing he had been holding back. Nora kissed him back, surprising herself with her own desire. She had expected to approach this part of marriage with trepidation, but instead she felt eager, curious, ready. They made their way inside, hands clasped, and James led her to the larger bedroom that was now theirs. He lit the lamp with shaking hands, and in the golden light they came together. He was gentle and patient, and if there was awkwardness, there was also tenderness and a growing passion that burned away any uncertainty. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Nora rested her head on his chest. She could hear his heart beating, steady and strong. "Are you all right?" James asked, his fingers threading through her hair. "I am more than all right." She pressed a kiss to his chest. "I am happy." She felt him smile against the top of her head. "So am I." They talked in the darkness, sharing secrets and dreams they had not dared voice before. James told her about the cattle operation he wanted to build, the legacy he hoped to leave. Nora told him about the music school she had once dreamed of starting, how she had given lessons to girls who could never afford to pay properly because she believed everyone should have access to beauty. "You could still do that," James said. "Once we are more established, there must be children around here who would benefit from lessons." Maybe. Nora let herself imagine it, a future where she could share her love of music while building a life with this man. It seemed almost too good to be true. The weeks that followed were ones of adjustment and discovery. Nora learned the full scope of ranch work, from branding cattle to mending fences. She proved to be a quick study and fearless in the face of hard labor. James, in turn, began to relax around her, showing her the humor and warmth he had kept hidden beneath his serious exterior. They developed rituals. Coffee on the porch at sunrise, watching the land wake up. Music in the evenings with Nora playing and James sometimes humming along. Nights in their shared bed, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patient exploration. One evening about a month after the wedding, as Nora played a particularly complicated reel, James interrupted her. "I have been thinking about something." She set down the banjo. "What is it?" "The cattle market is good right now and we had a decent winter. I think we could afford to bring on some help, maybe expand the herd, but that would mean more work for both of us, at least in the short term. I am not afraid of work." "I know," he smiled at her. "That is one of the things I love about you." The words hung in the air between them. It was the first time either of them had used that word. Nora felt her heart skip. "Love?" she asked softly. James's ears turned red, but he did not look away. "Yes, love. I know it is fast, but that is what this is. I love you, Nora. The way you play music like it is the most natural thing in the world. The way you attack ranch work with the same intensity. The way you laugh at my terrible jokes, all of it." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes. "I love you too. I think I have been falling in love with you since the day I arrived and you said the banjo was all we needed. You saw me, really saw me, when I had nothing but music to offer." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "You are all I need. Everything else is just extra." They held each other for a long moment, and Nora felt something settle deep in her soul. This was home. This man, this place, this life they were building together. It was not what she had expected when she boarded that train in Missouri, but it was so much better than anything she could have imagined. Spring turned into summer, and the ranch thrived. James hired a young man named Daniel to help with the cattle, a quiet kid from town who needed work and proved to be reliable. With the extra hands, they were able to expand the herd and improve the infrastructure. Nora threw herself into making the house a real home, sewing curtains and planting a vegetable garden, and even convincing James to let her paint the kitchen a cheerful yellow. In July, Sarah Holloway mentioned in passing that there were several families in the area with children who might benefit from music lessons. Nora tried to dismiss the idea, but James encouraged her. "You should do it," he said. "You have a gift and you should share it." So Nora put out word through Sarah and Mrs. Chen that she was offering banjo lessons on Saturday afternoons. To her surprise, 5 students showed up that first week. They ranged in age from 7 to 15, children of ranchers and miners and shopkeepers. They were eager and enthusiastic, if not particularly talented at first. Nora loved it. She loved seeing their faces light up when they managed a new chord, loved hearing the music spread through the community. She charged very little, barely enough to cover the cost of strings and other supplies, but that was not the point. The point was the joy, the beauty, the connection. By August, she had 12 students. James built her a small studio space attached to the barn, just a single room with benches and good light, but it was hers. Her music school, the dream she had thought was dead and buried in Missouri. One Saturday afternoon, after her last student had left, James came into the studio and found her sitting on the bench with her banjo, a soft smile on her face. "Happy?" he asked, deliriously. She set down the instrument and went to him. "How did you know this was what I needed?" "Because you get the same look when you play music that I get when I am working the land. It is not just what you do, it is who you are." She kissed him, deep and grateful. "I do not know what I did to deserve you. You showed up with a banjo and no luggage," he grinned. "Best day of my life." That night, as they lay in bed, Nora felt a flutter in her belly that she had been noticing for a few weeks now. She had been fairly certain of what it meant, but she had wanted to be sure before she said anything. Now, with James's arm around her and the stars visible through the window, she decided it was time. "James? I think I might be pregnant." He went very still. Then he sat up and looked down at her, his eyes wide. "You think or you know? I am fairly certain. All the signs are there." She reached for his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." The expression on his face was one of pure wonder. "A baby, we are going to have a baby." Then he laughed, a sound of such joy that it made Nora's heart swell. "When? February, I think, maybe March." He pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. I love you so much. I am going to be a father. You are going to be a wonderful father." They spent the rest of the night making plans, dreaming about the future. James wanted to add a room onto the house before the baby came. Nora wanted to make sure they had everything they needed. They argued playfully about names and agreed they would have to wait until they knew if it was a boy or girl. The next months passed in a blur of activity. James worked like a man possessed, determined to get the addition built and winterized before the cold weather set in. Nora continued her music lessons until she was too pregnant to comfortably hold the banjo, then switched to teaching theory and simple singing. She sewed baby clothes and blankets, helped by Sarah Holloway and Mrs. Chen, who had become real friends. The winter was hard, with deep snows and bitter cold, but inside the house, everything was warm and full of anticipation. Nora's belly grew round, and James would spend evenings talking to it, telling their unborn child about the ranch and the mountains and all the things they would do together. In late February, on a night when the wind howled outside and the snow piled against the windows, Nora went into labor. Sarah came to help, and James paced the kitchen like a caged animal until Sarah finally chased him outside to chop wood or do something useful with his nervous energy. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next day. But finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Nora delivered a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the entire territory. James came in when Sarah called him, his face white and anxious. But when he saw Nora holding their son, everything else fell away. He knelt beside the bed and looked at them both with an expression of such love that Nora felt tears stream down her face. "He is perfect," James whispered. "You are both perfect. Do you want to hold him?" James took the baby with trembling hands, cradling him like he was made of glass. The baby stopped crying and looked up at his father with dark blue eyes. "Hello, little one," James said softly. "I am your papa, and I promise I am going to do everything I can to give you a good life." They named him William after James's father. William James Garrett. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's eyes and his mother's determined personality. Nora recovered quickly from the birth, aided by Sarah's knowledge of herbs and good food. Those early weeks were exhausting but magical. James was a hands-on father, changing diapers and walking the floor with William when he fussed at night. He built a cradle from pine he had cut himself, carving it with designs of horses and mountains. Nora sang lullabies and played soft music on the banjo, and William seemed to respond to it, his little face peaceful when the music filled the house. Spring came again, and with it, new life on the ranch. The cattle had calved well, and the herd was the largest it had ever been. James talked about buying the adjacent property, expanding their holdings. Nora resumed her music lessons, bringing William to the studio in a basket and teaching while he napped. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier than before but rich with purpose. Nora and James had become true partners in work and in parenting and in love. They still had their evening ritual of sitting on the porch, though now there was often a baby between them. They still talked about their dreams, but now they included dreams for William too. When William was 6 months old, a traveling photographer came through Sweetwater, and James insisted on having their picture taken. They dressed in their best clothes and sat stiffly in front of the camera, James standing behind Nora with his hand on her shoulder, Nora holding William in her lap. It was formal and posed, but if you looked closely, you could see the love in their eyes, the way they leaned toward each other. That photograph would hang in the house for the rest of their lives, a reminder of that moment, that season, that choice they had both made to take a chance on each other. Years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. William grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and music in equal measure. When he was 3, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was a girl, whom they named Margaret Rose, called Maggie from the moment she was born. She had her mother's red hair and her father's quiet determination. 2 years later came another boy, Robert, called Robbie, who was the wildest of the 3. And finally, when Nora was 32 and thought they were done, came another girl, little Annie, who was the baby of the family and ruled them all with her sweet smile. The ranch prospered. James did buy the adjacent land and then another parcel beyond that. They had enough cattle to require 3 hired hands, and Daniel, the young man who had started working for them years ago, was now the foreman. The house had been added onto twice and was now a sprawling, comfortable place that rang with children's laughter and music. Nora's music school grew as well. She had 20 students now and had trained 2 of her best pupils to help teach the younger ones. There was talk of building a proper music hall in Sweetwater, and Nora was on the committee planning it. James had gray threading through his dark hair now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. But when he looked at Nora, she still saw the same love that had been in his eyes that first time he said the words. She had lines too, and her hands were rough from work, but she had never felt more beautiful than when James smiled at her across a crowded room. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James gave her a gift. It was a new banjo, custom-made by a craftsman in Denver with inlays of turquoise and mother-of-pearl. It was the most beautiful instrument Nora had ever seen. "You said the banjo was all we needed," she said, tears streaming down her face as she ran her fingers over the polished wood. "But you have given me so much more. You gave me a life worth living," James said, pulling her close. "Everything good I have came from the day you stepped off that train with nothing but a banjo and more courage than any woman I have ever known." That night they sat on the porch as they had on that first night 10 years ago. The children were asleep inside, the ranch was quiet, and the stars were coming out. Nora played the new banjo, and the notes soared into the night sky, bright and clear and full of joy. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked. "Giving up Missouri, coming out here sight unseen," Nora set down the banjo and took his hand. "Not for a single moment. This is where I was always meant to be. With you." He kissed her, slow and sweet, and Nora felt the same flutter in her heart she had felt 10 years ago. Some loves burned hot and fast, but theirs had built slowly, like a good fire, and it would burn for the rest of their lives. As the years continued to roll by, the Garrett family became a fixture in the community. William grew into a tall, serious young man who shared his father's love of the land. He was 14 now and could do a man's work on the ranch. Maggie, at 11, was already showing signs of her mother's musical talent and her father's stubbornness. She played the banjo and the fiddle and had a voice like an angel. Robbie, at 9, was the daredevil of the family, always climbing something or racing something or getting into some kind of trouble. And little Annie, at 7, was the heart of them all, bringing light and laughter wherever she went. Nora was 36 now, and sometimes she could hardly believe the life she had built. The girl who had stepped off that train with nothing but a banjo seemed like a different person, someone from another life. But then she would catch sight of the banjo hanging on the wall, the one she had carried with her that day, and she would remember. Remember the fear and the hope and the leap of faith that had brought her here. James was 40 now, and the ranch was everything he had dreamed it could be. They ran 300 head of cattle, and the Garrett brand was known throughout the territory for quality stock. He had become a leader in the community, someone people turned to for advice and help. But for all his success, he never forgot what mattered most. Every evening, no matter how busy the day had been, he made time to sit with Nora on the porch. It was their ritual, their sacred time, and the children knew not to interrupt unless it was truly important. One evening in late summer, as they sat watching the sun paint the mountains gold and purple, James said, "I have been thinking about something." "That sounds ominous." Nora smiled at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Not ominous, just a thought." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "William is going to be ready to go out on his own in a few years. He is a good rancher, maybe better than I was at his age. I was thinking we could help him start his own spread. There is land available to the west, good grazing land." Nora felt a pang at the thought of William leaving, but she knew it was inevitable. Children grew up and made their own way. "That is a wonderful idea. I think he would love that. And Maggie?" James hesitated. "She is so talented, Nora. I think she could go further with her music than just teaching in Sweetwater. There are conservatories back east, places where she could really develop her gift. She is only 11, I know, but in a few years we should think about it." "I do not want to hold any of our children back from their dreams." Nora reached over and took his hand. "You are a good father. I try, you make it easy." He squeezed her fingers. "I want them to have opportunities we did not have. But I also want them to know where they come from, what it takes to build something from nothing. They know, you have shown them every day." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the light fade and the first stars appear. Nora thought about all the evenings they had sat here, all the conversations they had shared. This was the foundation of their marriage, she thought. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but these quiet moments of connection. The music hall was finally completed when Nora was 38. It was a beautiful building, with tall windows and excellent acoustics, built with donations from the community and a generous contribution from the Garrett family. The opening night was a gala affair, with people coming from as far as 2 days' ride to attend. Nora organized a concert, featuring her best students and several professional musicians she had convinced to make the journey. Maggie, now 13, was the star of the evening. She played a series of complicated pieces on both banjo and fiddle, and when she finished, the audience erupted in applause. Nora sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as James squeezed her hand so tight it almost hurt. After the concert, people crowded around to congratulate them. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s, pulled Nora aside. "You have done good work here. This town is better because of you." "We all did this together," Nora protested. "No, you started it. You brought music here when all we had was dust and hard work. That matters." That night, after they had gotten home and the children were in bed, James pulled Nora into his arms. "I am so proud of you. You have built something beautiful here." "We built it," she corrected. "I could not have done any of this without your support. Still, you had the vision. I just provided the foundation. He kissed her softly. "Thank you for sharing your gift with all of us." When William turned 18, James made good on his promise. He helped his son buy a parcel of land 30 miles to the west and provided enough cattle to start a small herd. It was hard watching him go, but Nora was proud of the man he had become. Tall and strong and fair, with a good head for business and a kind heart. William came back often to visit, and within 2 years he brought a girl named Emma to meet them. She was the daughter of a rancher from the next county over, and she looked at William the way Nora remembered looking at James in those early days. They married that fall in the new music hall, and Nora played at the wedding, her fingers flying over the strings as tears ran down her face. Maggie, at 16, was offered a scholarship to a conservatory in Boston. It was an incredible opportunity, but it meant leaving home for at least 3 years. The family discussed it for weeks, with Maggie torn between her love of music and her love of home. Finally, Nora sat her down and said, "You should go, not because you have to, but because you should see what else is out there. This will always be home, we will always be here, but you owe it to yourself to explore your gift fully." "What if I do not fit in there?" Maggie asked, her eyes fearful. "What if I am just a ranch girl with a banjo and they all laugh at me?" Nora smiled. "Then you will be a ranch girl with a banjo who is better than all of them. You have something special, Maggie, something real. Do not let fear keep you from discovering how special you are." So Maggie went east, and the house felt emptier without her bright presence. But she wrote long letters about her classes and her teachers and the music she was learning. And she came home every summer, more polished and sophisticated, but still their Maggie underneath. Robbie, true to form, decided he did not want to be a rancher. He wanted adventure, wanted to see what was beyond the mountains. At 17, he joined a survey crew mapping the Northern Territories. It worried Nora sick, but James reminded her that young men needed to find their own way. "We cannot hold them too tight," he said, though she could see the worry in his eyes too. "We raised them to be independent and strong, now we have to trust that." Only Annie stayed, at least for now. She was 15 and showed no interest in leaving. She loved the ranch and the animals and the life they had built. She helped Nora with the music school and James with the cattle, moving easily between both worlds. Nora was 43 now, and sometimes her hands ached from all the years of playing. James was 47, and his back bothered him on cold mornings. They were not old, not really, but they were not young either. They were in the season of life where the work they had done was bearing fruit, where they could start to see the legacy they were building. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James said, "Do you remember that first day, when you stepped off the train with that banjo, every detail?" Nora smiled at the memory. "I was so scared I had gambled everything on a stranger. So had I." He reached for her hand. "Best gamble I ever made." "Mine too." They sat there as the stars came out hand in hand, and Nora thought about all the miles they had traveled together. Not just the physical distance from that train platform to this porch, but the emotional journey from strangers to lovers to partners to parents. It had not always been easy, but it had been worth every moment. The years continued their steady march. William and Emma had 3 children, making Nora and James grandparents. Maggie finished her studies in Boston and returned home, though she traveled frequently to perform in cities across the country. She never married, saying she was married to her music, and Nora understood. Some people were meant for that kind of dedication. Robbie eventually settled in Montana, working as a guide for tourists who wanted to see the wilderness. He married a Blackfoot woman named Morning Star, and they had 2 children who visited every summer. Annie, at 22, married Daniel the foreman, who was now 45 and widowed with 2 children of his own. It surprised everyone except Nora, who had seen the way they looked at each other for years. Annie brought music and light into Daniel's life, and he gave her stability and devotion. They lived in a house on the ranch property, and Annie continued to help with both the cattle and the music school. Nora was 50 now, and her hair was more silver than red. James was 54, and his face was weathered like old leather. But when he looked at her, she still saw the young man who had said that a banjo was all they needed. And when she looked at him, she saw her home, her heart, her whole world. The ranch was a legacy now, something that would be passed down through generations. The music school had trained hundreds of students over the years, bringing beauty and culture to a place that had once been nothing but dust and sage. They had built something that mattered, something that would last. One spring evening, 30 years after Nora had first arrived in Sweetwater, they sat on the porch as they always did. The ranch was quiet, the work done for the day. In the distance, they could hear Annie singing as she put her stepchildren to bed. The sound drifted across the evening air, sweet and clear. "Play something," James said, gesturing to the banjo that Nora now kept on the porch for moments like this. She picked it up, the wood smooth and familiar under her fingers. She played the first song she had ever played in this house, a simple melody her mother had taught her. James listened with his eyes closed, a slight smile on his face. When she finished, he opened his eyes and looked at her. "Thank you. For what? For everything. For taking a chance on me. For building this life with me. For the music and the children and the love, for all of it." Nora set down the banjo and moved to sit beside him on the bench. He put his arm around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They had sat like this 1,000 times, but it never got old. This closeness, this comfort, this knowing that they were exactly where they belonged. "You know what I think," Nora said softly. "What?" "I think that day I arrived with just a banjo, I brought everything I needed, not because the banjo was valuable, but because it represented who I was. My music, my courage, my willingness to start over, and you saw that, you saw me." "I did see you." James kissed the top of her head, "and I have been grateful every day since." They sat there as the stars came out, as they had 1,000 times before, and would 1,000 times again if they were lucky. The ranch spread out around them, solid and enduring. The mountains rose in the distance, eternal and unchanging. And between it all, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a love that would echo through generations. Nora thought about the girl she had been, stepping off that train with nothing but hope and a musical instrument. She thought about how terrified and brave she had been in equal measure. If she could go back and tell that girl what was waiting for her, what life she would build, would that girl even believe it? But then again, that girl had believed in possibility. She had believed that somewhere out there was a life worth living, a love worth finding. And she had been right. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, James stood and offered Nora his hand. "Come on, let us go inside." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Together they walked into the house, leaving the banjo on the porch where it would wait for tomorrow. Because there would be a tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that followed. Days filled with work and music, and the love they had built together from nothing but a leap of faith and a worn banjo case. Years later, when Nora was 65 and James was 69, they still sat on that porch every evening. Their bodies moved slower now, and there were aches and pains that came with age. But their love had only deepened, mellowed like fine wine into something rich and irreplaceable. The ranch was run mostly by Annie and Daniel now, with help from William's oldest son. Maggie was famous in musical circles, known for bringing traditional mountain music to concert halls across the country. Robbie had become a successful outfitter, his business thriving in Montana. All their children and grandchildren came home for Christmas each year, filling the house with noise and laughter and life. One evening in late summer, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Nora picked up the old banjo, the one she had carried with her that first day. It was battered now, the wood scarred from decades of use, but it still made beautiful music. She played and James listened, and the notes drifted across the land they had worked and loved for 40 years. When she finished, James reached over and took her hand. "That is still all we need," he said quietly. "You and me and the music, everything else is just blessing." Nora looked at him, this man who had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams, and smiled. "Everything else is just blessing," she agreed. They sat there until the stars came out, hand in hand, hearts full. And if you had asked either of them if they had any regrets, if they would have done anything differently, they would have said no. Because from the moment Nora stepped off that train with a banjo and no luggage, from the moment James said those words, their path had been set. And it had been perfect. The music faded into the night, but its echo would remain. In the children they had raised, the legacy they had built, the love they had shared. Some stories end with a beginning and others begin with an ending. But this story, the story of Nora and James Garrett, was one continuous song, played out over decades, each note building on the last until it created something beautiful and whole and true. And that banjo, the one that had carried Nora into her new life, hung on the wall of the Garrett homestead for generations after, a reminder that sometimes all you need is courage, love, and a willingness to believe in possibility. The rest will follow, as surely as music follows the touch of fingers on strings, as surely as love follows an open heart. As Nora and James grew older still, they began to think about their final legacy. They had lived good lives, raised fine children, built something that would last. But they wanted to make sure that the values they held dear would continue. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. All their children and grandchildren came, along with friends from across the territory. The music hall in Sweetwater hosted a concert in their honor, with Maggie performing and students from Nora's school, some now in their 40s and 50s, coming back to play. At the reception afterward, held in the big barn that James had expanded 3 times over the years, William stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "They taught us that love is built on hard work, that music can heal the soul, and that courage means taking chances even when you are scared. Everything we are, everything we have, comes from the example they set." Nora felt tears stream down her face as she looked around at all the people gathered. Her children and grandchildren, yes, but also the students she had taught, the neighbors who had become family, the community they had helped build. This was their legacy, not just the land or the cattle or even the music, but the connections they had fostered, the lives they had touched. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Nora and James sat on their porch one more time. They were both 70 now, and the years sat heavy on their bones, but they were together and that was all that mattered. 50 years, James said wonderingly. "How did we get so lucky?" "It was not luck," Nora replied. "It was choice. Every day we chose each other, we chose this life. We chose love. Best choices I ever made." She leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Do you remember what you said that first day, that the banjo was all we needed?" "I do, and I meant it. Everything else was just details. We filled in some pretty good details, though." He chuckled. "We did at that." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's presence in the way only people who have spent a lifetime together can be. Finally, James said, "I have been thinking about what comes after." Nora knew what he meant. They were both old now, and the future was no longer an endless stretch before them. "What about it? I want to be buried here on this land, and I want you beside me when the time comes. I want our children to know that this place, this ranch, this is where our hearts are. I want that too." She squeezed his hand. "But not yet. We still have more music to play, more sunsets to watch." "As many as we can get," he agreed. They were granted 5 more years. 5 more years of watching the seasons change, of seeing their grandchildren grow, of making music and memories. James's health began to fail slowly, his heart weakening with age. But even in his final days, he insisted on sitting on the porch with Nora, holding her hand and watching the land they had built together. He died on a spring morning with Nora beside him, and all their children gathered around. His last words were, "Thank you for the music, my love. Thank you for everything." Nora held him as he slipped away, and though her heart broke, she also felt gratitude. They had been given 55 years together, longer than many people got. They had loved and been loved, had built something beautiful, had lived fully. That was a gift beyond measure. She buried him on a rise overlooking the ranch, in a spot where you could see the mountains and the house and the creek winding through the cottonwoods. She planted wildflowers around the grave, the kind that came back year after year. For the next 3 years, Nora lived alone in the house. Her children wanted her to come stay with them, but she refused. This was her home, hers and James's, and she was not ready to leave it. She continued to teach music, though at a slower pace. She sat on the porch every evening and played her banjo, talking to James as if he were still there beside her. In many ways, he was. She felt his presence in every corner of the house, in the land they had worked, in the family they had built. Death had taken his body, but it could not take what they had created together. When Nora was 78, she knew her own time was coming. She gathered her children around her and told them her wishes. She wanted to be buried beside James, wanted the old banjo, the one she had brought with her that first day, to be hung in the music hall as a reminder of where it all began. "Do not mourn too much," she told them. "I have lived a beautiful life, far better than I ever dreamed possible. And soon I will be with your father again. That is not sad. That is as it should be." She died peacefully in her sleep on a summer night, with the windows open and the sound of crickets filling the air. Her children found her in the morning, a slight smile on her face, her hand stretched out toward James's side of the bed. They buried her beside James, just as she had requested. At the funeral, Maggie played the banjo, the notes soaring into the sky like birds taking flight. All of Nora's students, current and former, came to pay their respects. The service lasted for hours, filled with music and stories and memories. The old banjo was hung in the music hall with a plaque that read, "Nora Fitzgerald Garrett, 1858 to 1936. She arrived with a banjo and no luggage and built a legacy of music and love that will echo through generations." The ranch continued, passed down to Annie and her children. William's descendants ran a successful operation of their own. Maggie's students went on to teach others, spreading Nora's love of music far and wide. Robbie's children carried the spirit of adventure and openness to new experiences that both their grandparents had embodied. And every year, on the anniversary of that day when Nora stepped off the train in Sweetwater, the family would gather at the ranch. They would visit the graves on the hill, would play music and tell stories about the couple who had started it all. The children who had never known Nora and James learned about them through these stories, learned about courage and love and the power of taking chances. The music hall in Sweetwater still stands, and the old banjo still hangs on the wall. When tourists ask about it, the locals tell the story of the mail-order bride who arrived with nothing but a musical instrument and built a life that mattered. They tell of the cowboy who saw past the lack of luggage to the wealth of spirit underneath. They tell of love that started with a leap of faith and grew into something that changed an entire community. Because that is what legacy is. Not just the things you build with your hands, but the lives you touch, the love you share, the beauty you bring into the world. Nora and James Garrett understood that from the very beginning. When James said that the banjo was all they needed, he was not dismissing material wealth. He was recognizing something deeper, that music and love and courage are worth more than any amount of luggage. The house still stands on the ranch, carefully preserved by the family. Visitors can see the room where Nora taught music lessons, the kitchen where she made countless meals, the porch where she and James sat every evening for 55 years. They can see the studio James built for her, the addition they put on when the children came, the marks on the doorframe showing how tall each child grew. But more than the physical remnants, what remains is the spirit of what they built. In every student who learned to play an instrument in Sweetwater, in every rancher who treated their land with respect and their family with love, in every person who took a chance on an uncertain future because they believed in possibility. The legacy of Nora and James Garrett lives on. Their story, which began on a dusty platform with a banjo and a moment of recognition, became part of the fabric of the place. It became a story told to children to teach them about courage, told to young couples to teach them about love, told to anyone who would listen to remind them that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the least amount of baggage. And if you go to Sweetwater today, more than a century later, you can still see the banjo in the music hall. You can still visit the ranch, now a historical site. You can still hear the echo of the music that Nora played and the love that she and James shared. Because some things are too powerful to be contained by time or death. Some things become eternal. The story of the mail-order bride who arrived with a banjo and no luggage, and the cowboy who said that was all they needed, is one of those eternal things. It reminds us that love is not about what you bring to the table, but about who you are willing to become. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest wealth is found in the simplest things: music, connection, and the courage to believe in possibility. And so their story ends where it began, with a banjo and a choice and a love that proved strong enough to build an empire of the heart. They rest together on the hill overlooking the land they loved, and the wind carries the echo of music across the prairie. A song that will never truly end because it lives on in every heart that hears it and chooses to believe in the power of love, courage, and a simple banjo that carried more than just strings and wood. It carried hope.